This is Frank Yosa here, CEO of Ketone Aid, and I decided that there's a lot of controversy around the Tour de France, what's going on. The leader admitted to taking ketone esters, and suddenly the media is on fire about this, and some other teams are crying foul, saying that it should be banned. One person's excuse, or one group's excuse, was that they didn't have access to ketone esters. So then I put out a post saying, hey, anybody that wants ketone esters, I will FedEx it overnight. And I have someone who's a doctor who happens to have some ketone ester in France. They are going to make arrangements to get it to the athlete even faster. And I'm already getting responses from actual riders. I saw the message and I was like, shouldn't you be riding now? But it was a short day today. And so I decided to bring in William Curtis. He has co-authored 4 papers or chapters in textbooks regarding aging, the great nucleotide, radiation, and stuff like that. And he's written these papers with Dr. Veach from NIH, Todd King. So he's I would consider him one of the top 5 experts that really understand this particular molecule, D-beta hydroxybutyrate, D1,3-butanediol, the ketone ester, also known as the ketone monoester to be more specific, and nicknamed the Veach ester because he's the one that, him and Dr. Todd King came up with this 15 years ago. So thanks for joining us, Mr. Curtis.
Hi, good to be here.
So just to give people, first of all, another tidbit of information on you. You do have Parkinson's, so they might see some movement that you have, and that's life. But I wanted to let them know that ahead of time so that they didn't just get distracted by that.
Okay.
So let's start off with safety. So one of the teams, in an attempt to try to find some excuse to get it banned so that they can, stop the team that's winning, they try to scrounge and find something about safety. Can we go into the safety of this molecule, including their excuse? They mentioned something about liver. How long has this been in development? What toxicology has been done with it? And let's talk about safety first.
Well, the liver thing is sort of a red herring. The paper that mentioned that clearly stated that they forgot to put in the right amount of vitamins. And
this is with mice. This is where they give mice huge quantities?
Rats.
Rats. Yeah. Sorry, mice, rats.
So as far as I know, there's no evidence that it damaged the liver in a paper published by a reputable scientist. I know that it's being tested for some things that have required further toxicology tests, and it's come through with flying colors. So in terms of danger,
the GRAS, the FDA GRAS has already gone through that stage, right?
Sure. And in terms of danger, this has been tested for millions of years. It's a natural product. The 1,3-butanediol might not be in very large concentrations, but as soon as it enters the liver, it's converted into the active form of the beta-hydroxybutyrate. So the beta-hydroxybutyrate, I think, is about as safe a molecule as you can get. Any molecule, even water or glucose, can be potentially hazardous.
So let me jump in there. So the molecule itself, the Veach ester, is half D-beta-hydroxybutyrate, and then it's an ester, meaning it's a bond with something called D1,3-butanediol. When it gets consumed and goes into the gut, it splits in half, and the D-beta-hydroxybutyrate goes into the bloodstream. But then the D1,3-butanediol, that half of the molecule, goes to the liver and then makes another round of D-beta-hydroxybutyrate. And for those that might know about MCT-oil-C8, it's kind of similar to that, how it goes through the liver to make ketones, but 10 to 20 times stronger than any ketone oil. Is that a correct description of how the molecule separates and where it goes?
Yes, and I think that's why these are the only compounds that you see in the Tour de France. You don't see other MCT oils, I don't believe.
Ketone salts, the ketone salts.
Ketone salts you wouldn't see.
Yeah. So, and And the D-beta hydroxybutyrate is what the body makes naturally. So if you do a ketogenic diet or you fast for multiple days, the body will go to your fat stores and then send that, correct me if I'm wrong, through the liver to make beta hydroxybutyrate. So it's making the exact same molecule that is now being, consumed.
That's correct.
Right. Okay. So as far as safety, they've been testing this on mice, 15 years ago. Then they did human trials to get the GRAS. It's been on the market for a year. The only adverse reactions I've seen with people taking too much is low blood sugar. So if they take too much on an empty stomach, it can drop blood sugar. But these athletes are doing what we call more likely doing what we call the dual fuel protocol, where you actually increase glucose and take ketones. Can you talk about why you would do the dual fuel?
Well, you get a very small performance advantage from the ketones, and you only get that if you take it in combination with glucose. So it gives you maybe a 1.5% performance increase. That's in common with other energy drinks or things like that, but it gives you something that you can stack that can't be stacked. Other things can't. You can't add glucose to glucose and get more.
Right, you're already taking the maximum amount of glucose that the body can take.
So now amount of glucose. Right. So you can stack this, and that gives you a small percentage boost. And then the other thing that they seem to mention all the time is that it preserves the glycogen in your muscle. Glycogen is a very branched polymer of glucose, and you can cut those glucose molecules off rather rapidly, and glucose is a better fuel for sprinting than the fatty acids are. So if you can preserve your glycogen till the end of the race, you have a big advantage.
Now, what about the ester benefits in terms of altitude and going, uphill workouts? We have some anecdotal, non-scientific evidence. By the way, the 1.5 is correct. That's from the scientific papers, but that's not necessarily what we see in, with our athletes that are taking it directly. Now, is it placebo? I don't know, but they're seeing, far greater than 1.5. And I don't agree with the protocols that were used 5 years ago. And paper after paper, they tend to want to keep the same protocols, even though they might not necessarily be, the best protocols. Can you talk about altitude, what it does there, heart rate, and going uphill?
Altitude, heart rate, and going uphill. I'm afraid that I don't know that much about the differences with altitude, heart rate, and going uphill. There is something with regard to altitude and oxygen.
Right, that's what I meant, yeah.
Okay. There's this other compound that's made by, I think the inventor was Patrick Arnold, who did the Balco scandals with Barry Bonds so this molecule is made of 2 acetoacetates. And acetoacetates are the low energy version of beta hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate, the 2 ketone bodies. I don't really consider.
So before we go into this, you're starting to talk about the other ketone ester that's out there. So in a couple of the news stories, one of the doctors said, oh, well, the jury's out. Ketone esters don't always work for sports performance. And they're citing this one paper where a quote-unquote ketone ester impaired performance. That ketone ester is called an acetoacetate with racemic 1,3-butane. Just to give people a higher level, what you're going into. So you're describing that ketone ester. Go ahead.
Exactly. That ketone ester is called a ketone ester, just like the beach ketone ester, but it's made with the low energy form of the ketones, the acetoacetate. And when you are breathing, it's CO2 that stimulates breath. You can go into a room that's filled with nitrogen and you won't sense that you have any shortness of breath. You'll just eventually die from a lack of oxygen and not really know what happened. But if you lean over a container filled with dry ice, you'll really get a strong whiff of CO2, and it'll hurt your lungs. So anyway, when people were taking this Patrick Arnold version that had the low energy form, they could hold their breath longer. And that is probably because you're not producing as much CO2, because you're slowing down the oxidative phosphorylation, because the low energy form actually has to be made into the higher energy form, and that inhibits oxidative phosphorylation where the CO2 is being made. Now, if you take the Beach ketone monoester, you'll have a hard time holding your breath anywhere near as long as you can without it. And I'm wondering if some of the athletes aren't sensing a need to breathe because you're making more CO2 with the ketone monoester. And I think there may be a secret that you just have to push on, because that sensation of more CO2 being produced has nothing to do with the amount of ATP you're producing. And you're actually going to, but I think the Tour de France people are very much used to feeling that sensation of CO2 making them want to gasp for breath. And I think they're probably looking more to the sensation of their muscles to determine how much they can push.
Right, I did try that myself. When I heard about the breath hold, I tried to hold the breath with the ketone ester, monoester, and I went from 60 seconds to something like 45 seconds. So then, yeah, you helped me explain, why it might do the opposite of this ester. And in that paper, also, they tested the blood ketones along the way. And the blood ketones of D-beta hydroxybutyrate that you can test in your blood had risen 0.1 versus the other papers that went to 5.0, 4.0, 5.0. It's just night and day different. It's not commercially available. So it's just, but that's a paper that naysayers need to point to have some contrasting view.
Sure. And I think it's unfortunate that in the scientific literature they aren't being clear as to what the ketone ester is and whether or not they're dealing with a racemic mixture or pure beta hydroxybutyrate. It gets very confusing. Usually when they don't specify, they're dealing with a racemic mixture.
Yeah, I saw one paper where they used one molecule and they listed it out, and then 2 years later they used a completely different molecule, but instead of listing out that it's a different molecule, they just used the same name, ketone ester, and then buried in the footprint what the actual molecule is. And it's just, it's confusing enough, and then to start doing some tricks like that and burying it so that you can kind of try to equate the two, it just confuses, the marketplace.
Yeah.
So let me ask you about the, as far as, safety. Let's talk about, just real briefly, you did a paper on longevity and, this molecule as a health food for, longevity purposes. And because, the Tour de France, they're scared about something being unhealthy, and here something is actually being shown to help longevity potentially in humans.
Yeah, I think this is really the message that's being missed in the Tour de France. The paper where they simulated the Tour de France and showed a 15% increase on the last day. If you think about it, you could never get a 15% increase just from storing glycogen. And something happens there to preserve the basic health of the athletes. And we think that a lot of aging has to do with inflammation that gets stuck, that doesn't get turned off. And the beta hydroxybutyrate does several things to turn off inflammation. And they're probably beyond the scope of a discussion like this, but hypoxia inducing factor is something that the athletic scientists will be familiar with. That's what the body senses when there's...
Oh, you hold on, your camera's slipping. Something's going on. It's just flying off. All right.
I'm using a music stand. So, yeah, I was saying the hypoxia inducing factor is something they'll be familiar with, and in the muscles that goes to the to the hypoxia response element and turns on pyruvate dehydrogen kinase 4, and that when you start to get
You're losing you again.
okay, when you start to get fit, you turn off the muscle's ability to burn glucose and turn up the ability to burn fats. And that's real important because it keeps your brain from starving. But that same hypoxia inducing factor, when it's in the brain, it turns on a different PDK, pyruvate dehydrogen kinase, that blocks pyruvate from going into the mitochondria of the brain. Okay, well, in your brain, you produce a different version of the pyruvate dehydrogenase kinase. It's pyruvate dehydrogenase kinase 1, and that's designed to shut down the oxidative phosphorylation in your brain. And so the ketones will stop the production of pyruvate dehydrogenase kinase 1 in your brain. And they will also stop these other things that are causing inflammation to get stuck. So I think that that's why your brain gets more ATP, and by turning off the inflammation and turning on the energy in your brain, you're going to be a lot more, you're going to do a lot better cognitively. And you're also going to turn off this inflammation that just gets stuck. So when you see a 15% increase on the last day, that has a lot to do with the mechanisms that are involved with protecting the body from aging.
So one thing is protecting the body and recovery, because that study was a 3-week study where they took Ester a few times a day, and they're just more recovered every single day. And we've seen that with our athletes where they use a heart rate variability monitor, and they'll have an amazing improvement one day, and then the next day the heart rate monitor says that they had taken the day off. So like just the recovery is just even more insane than the athletic performance itself. But as far as the brain, making the brain sharper and more resilient, like there must be a level of mental fatigue, obviously, that happens in the Tour de France. And if you're feeding your brain differently and you can not be as mentally zonked, it seems like, that would be a significant improvement as well to the overall outcome by helping your brain first.
Yeah, I think the argument that you might be damaging your body somehow taking the ketone monoesters in the Tour de France is sort of crying in the soup from people who made sort of perhaps a wrong decision. I respect their cautiousness, but I used to look for people who were working with nutrition in the Tour de France because we couldn't study it for disease purposes until it was sold as a sports drink. And they would always tell me that Dr. Clark's methods were wrong and stuff. And now they're sort of crying, well, help us because we made a wrong decision. So, I don't really feel sorry for them.
Right. When you say wrong decision, meaning that they didn't believe the science, they didn't read the papers, understand what it would actually do, and they just thought that it was yet another, sugar drink or something like that.
Yeah. When people see papers, it's often hard to tell which ones are good science and which ones are not. And when I'm pretty sure that all these nutritionists were aware of it for a number of years. And when they find out that they were wrong, then, they're going to react in these ways.
Right. But I mean, so what would, I mean, couldn't a comeback to that response saying, hey, in 10 years, I'm worried that someone's going to come back and say that they were harmed? What about sugar? I mean, all the harmful effects of sugar and just chugging, I don't know how many grams of straight glucose they take multiple times a day for, 20 days. What's more harmful, chugging glucose or ketone esters?
Well, I think the Tour de France is really hard on people's bodies. My dad used to cycle, and I remember him going over the handlebars. And if you get a concussion, you could wind up like Davis Finney or Muhammad Ali with Parkinson's easily. And I think that the ketone monoesters will really be your best bet at preventing the long-term damage. You're going to have to take glucose on the Tour de France, so
right.
That's a given. But this 15% increase in performance at the end of the tour, that's because you're not destroying muscle cells, and you're just generally protecting your body from reactive oxygen species and all the good things that ketone esters are theorized to do. And that's an amazing number that I don't think anyone can really comprehend how much the ketone esters are protecting.
So if a team were to try to, and normally I suggest that you take this in practice several times before doing it on game day, but if a team decides right now in the middle of the Tour de France that they want to incorporate ketone esters, my suggestion has been, and I'd like to see your take on it, that it might be too risky to take the full protocol, which is the dual fuel and taking large quantities before and every 90 minutes, and then or just a bolus right before the last 45-minute climb. I think that would be just, everyone reacts differently to it. I don't suggest doing that. So what I suggested is you can either just take it after the performance, just for recovery, taking it after maybe taking 20 mLs of KE4, and then 15 mLs twice after that, every 2 hours. So a total of 50 mLs after the performance, so that your next day is more, you're more recovered the next day. Because I don't want someone taking it beforehand, then they feel a placebo, before the race, they feel a placebo effect, they go out a little bit too hard because they're expecting something, and then they completely, bonk. Any of your thoughts?
Yeah, who knows? They could throw up and be the next person to drop out of the race mysteriously.
So what do you think about that protocol? Either doing it just after the race, or maybe selectively keeping even a small amount, 30 mLs, half of a small bottle, in the last 45 minutes of the race, just to kind of stay conservative with something that is new to you.
Well, there's no way that they can test it in the race, and they don't have a day off that I'm aware of.
No, I meant, well, no testing. I just meant if they were to just go straight out and use it a day of a race.
They probably have nothing to lose in the race. They're obviously not the leaders because they weren't taking it in the first place.
Right.
But when you think of all the advantages that you have in training, if you're taking it in training, it's just like the 15% increase at the end of the Tour de France.
Right. So a lot of people think of it also as a game day performance and maybe game day recovery, but it actually is also about having it for many weeks and many months leading up to the Tour de France, using it on a daily basis so that your recovery is better. Can you talk about the mTOR and what it does for just muscle growth, where your muscles just get stronger, bigger, and then and heal, and how that works?
Well, mTOR is a signaling pathway, and it's promoted by the excess of NADPH, which is how you get an advantage from ketones. The ketones produce an excess of citrate. The citrate comes out of the mitochondria, and it makes NADPH. And the NADPH is tied to many signals that stop bad things from happening and promote good things. Also, the NADH is another thing that is preserved, and it tells you to make more mitochondria. There's just so many things that happen when you take ketones that I think for sports performance, it's not like when you take these vitamins and you have no clue whether they're working or not. When you take ketone monoester, you know what's going on. You feel a huge difference.
All right. So did I miss anything? I think we covered a lot for the athletes. I might say, hey, doctor, go take a look at this video. I think it can be the most unique content that isn't out there anywhere for the doctors to kind of better understand it and give a thumbs up or thumbs down for letting an athlete take it tomorrow before the Tour de France even ends.
Yeah, I feel sorry for these people who weren't offered the but they have scientists on each team and they have to make decisions. So
well, there's a lot of junk science out there. There's a lot of competition. You've got certain sugar that's slow release sugar, or like a different type of sugar, or caffeine, and just beet juice helps. Just endless products out there. It's very hard to look through thousands of different claims and different products to pick the winner. But we didn't talk about this, but Greg Henderson was told a story about how the leading team a few years ago dropped a bottle on the side of the road, and they were freaking out for many miles. And then he figured out when he got on the bus, his friend said, "Oh no, they're taking a ketone ester that's like $5,000 a bottle." Well, before we came along, so this has already been in the Tour de France for many years, but only one team had it for 5 years. And Lance Armstrong's podcast last year was the first time that a Team Sky, former Team Sky member, admitted that they've been using ketones for multiple years. And only now that it's commercially available are these new teams starting to, figure it out, jump on the bandwagon and go all in. But my guess is it's still only 20, 30% of the teams. And even then, they might not necessarily even give it to all their athletes.
Do you think it's cost that's prohibiting the teams from trying it?
No, I don't think it's cost. I think it's just noise, too many different alternatives and time to evaluate it themselves. And just, they're trying so many other things. They're trying, God knows what they're trying, but I'm sure they already have literally a list of 20 things that they're trying out. And whether it gets on that list and moves up or not, it's just,
well, it seems so easy to try. You get on your you do a time trial and you do it with and without, and you just see what happens. I can't imagine.
I don't know. I think it's a little bit harder than that. What I found in the real world, that people like different amounts. Some people actually like small amounts. They take 10 mLs, $5 worth of ketone ester beforehand. Those are keto-based people. And then there's people that are not keto-based people. So your diet, I think, matters. All those scientific papers were done on non-keto athletes. I think that's a huge variable.
Yes, it is.
Tour de France athletes are keto. They're going to respond differently to the ester. So I disagree a little bit there. I think it's a little bit tougher than just take the drink and go. There's different protocols you've got to try and try and nail it. I mean, we have a Facebook group where there's hundreds of people talking about how they try it, and they have to sometimes try it, 3 or 4 ways, and we'll get posts saying, "Oh, it didn't work," and then finally when it works, they said, "Oh my God, look at these numbers," and their numbers are way, way above 1.5%. So I think it takes a little bit more than just that one-off try it. I wish it was that easy.
Well, you seem to have the most experience of anyone working with the athletes.
Yeah, I do. But people sometimes want to see science. They want to see the scientific papers, and the problem is those papers can be flawed, and then the other papers always piggyback off of the same protocol because they don't want to change too many variables. So then you don't have necessarily the best protocol, but that's what the science is. And there's science, and then there's real life, and then there's crowdsourcing and biohacking, where you use multiple people's experiences and just say, hey, okay, the science says this, but this is what I'm doing, and it works for me, and continue with that.
Science takes years to find some of these answers that you're able to find rather quickly.
I mean, they still haven't figured out glucose. What's the ideal amount of glucose to take per hour? I mean, actually, they probably just figured that out, but that probably took them 15, 20 years to figure out the exact proper amount of glucose, because you don't want to take too much. You don't want to have excess energy. You don't want to take it too soon. So there's just many variables.
I think it was 2 years ago I made this prediction that if you had Parkinson's and you were going to take the ketone monoester, that it would increase your tetrahydrobiopterin, and that's used to synthesize a number of neurotransmitters, and it took 2 years to actually demonstrate that in the lab. It's not been published, but that's just a very small part of the theory of how we think it's working, and the speeds for science are very, very slow.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.